All right, so welcome to this presentation on exploring the gender pay gap. My name is Cinnamon Porter, and my pronouns are they and she, and I am the mission educator at YWCA McLean County. So before we begin, let's start with some community agreements on how we will operate this space. The first one is to be present. So if you feel comfortable and you're able to, go ahead, turn on your cameras. We are here for an hour, so let's try to make the most out of our time together. The second one, participate. So the way that I like to work these presentations is to have a dialogue with you all. I'll share some information, but I also want to hear from you, and I'll have some questions that will need your feedback. So feel free to either raise your hand, post in the chat box, or unmute yourself. The next one is active listening. So listen to understand and to learn. Open and honest communication. We all bring different experiences to this topic. So say what you need to say, but still be respectful of each other. Embrace discomfort. So discomfort is a good thing. Lean into that. And when you lean into this discomfort, it shows that you have the potential to grow. And then I wanted to see if anyone else had any other community agreements they would like to add. All right, I'm gonna take silence as you all are good with moving ahead. So let's define the gender pay gap. So when we're talking about the gender pay gap, we are talking about the difference in wage and earning based off of gender. So when we are talking about gender in this presentation, it's going to be mostly focused on the comparison of men and women, and that is unfortunately just due to the data that is available to us. But I do want to mention that, and we'll talk about this at another point, that trans folks are also disproportionately affected by the gender pay gap. There are different ways to calculate the gender pay gap. So I will have two different statistics, but regardless, this information is sometimes calculated in different ways, but it consistently shows that there is a gap in wages. And then lastly, social identities affect people's pay. So we're going to talk about intersectionality, but when we talk about one, gender, women earn less than men. But when you tack on other social identities like race, citizenship, etc., that also affects someone's pay. So here's my first question for you all. What do you think the gender pay gap looks like? So for every dollar that a man earns, how much do you think a woman earns? You could go ahead and post in the chat box, or you can take yourself on mute and share. So again, for every dollar that a man makes, how much does a woman make in comparison? So someone said 80 cents to the dollar, 60 cents. And yeah, both of those are close, and we will look at some statistics on that. So looking at this demographic here, this is from the US Census Bureau. So it shows that the gender wage gap is most significant for women of color. So when we look at white women, they make 79 cents to the dollar that a white man would make. Black women make 62 cents, Latino women make 54 cents, Asian women make 90 cents, and then indigenous folks make, women make 57 cents. And so this is even despite the fact that we've seen a huge increase in women advancing their education and their high labor participation in the market. And something that really stuck out to me, and I'll have an image later for this, is that the average woman must work far into the next year to make up for that dollar. And so we'll talk about how long does it take for women to catch up to that dollar. This gender pay gap is closing, but not fast enough. And so at the current rate, it will take 257 years to achieve wage equality. 257 years. I don't got that kind of time. I don't know about y'all, but I'm gonna need things to, I'm gonna need this gender wage gap to close more quickly. And we'll talk about how we can do that. This image talks about, it shows a comparison of men of the same race versus women. So if we look at that first column, Black men make 87 cents to that of a white man, when Black women make 61%. So what, or 61 cents, excuse me. So what we see is that race still affects the wage gap, but women are disproportionately affected by this. One thing that stuck out to me was this next column where Asian American women actually make more than Asian men. And so I'm gonna have to do some digging into that. But we see for the rest of the columns that, again, if you are a man, even if you are a man of color, you still make more than a woman of color to each dollar earned. So before I move on, what sticks out to you about these two images here? Are these shocking to you? Thoughts, feedbacks about these two images? And again, you can share in the chat box or feel free to take yourself off of mute. Someone wrote in the chat box that it's not surprising, but definitely disappointing. And I completely agree. We should have wage equality, and we'll talk later on some ways that we can achieve it. But we're in 2021, right? We talk about equality often, but unfortunately, we don't see equality in wages and in pay. Someone else said it shows how prevalent institutional racism is. Absolutely. So when we talk about intersectionality, which is the overlapping of social identities and excuse me, how that affects pay, we see that, yes, our systems and the structures that we work in negatively impact folks who are marginalized and oppressed. And so this presentation here focuses a lot on race, but if we were to tack on other social identities like ability status, we would see that wage gap widen even further. Someone had a question. Does this compare similar careers and positions or overall earnings for men and women? So it takes into account a little bit of both. And as I mentioned, this is coming from the US Census Bureau. So you can look on their website. They have a lot of different resources talking about the gender wage gap, but it is mostly focused on the overall earnings. But we will talk about what we say equal pay for equal play. So there should be equal pay, across positions and careers. Good questions. Any other questions or thoughts about these images? All right. So as I mentioned, let me take a step back. So what are some of the effects of this wage gap? One, we see that women tend to be in these lower paying jobs. And so what does that mean? We will talk in a next slide about why women are in these lower paying jobs. With this differential in the wage gap, we see unsafe work environments, particularly for women. We see a lack of social benefits. And then, as someone mentioned, this institutional aspect of it, it perpetuates a cycle of poverty for women, right? And as I mentioned, it's going to take us 257 years at this rate to close the gap. So that's going to be generations that are negatively harmed by this gender wage gap. And I would be remiss if we didn't talk about COVID-19, am I right? So when we think about COVID-19 and how this has impacted the gender wage gap, we know that women make up a majority of workers on the front lines in the pandemic. And so how the wage gap affects them, they are in these lower paying jobs. So we see more unemployment for women or underemployment because of COVID-19, but then also the stress and tolls that it takes on women during this pandemic. We had a question in the chat box. Someone says, how does age impact this? Does the gap decrease or increase as women get older? That's a great question. So what we see is, when we, again, referencing intersectionality, we talk about ageism. So women who are older adults, they would be negatively impacted by this gender wage gap. So they would be making even less than what we showed before. And then also younger women as well. Great question. So like I said, we are in 2021, right? Let me ask you all, why do you think this gender wage gap persists? Because this is definitely not a new issue. So why do you think it is still around in 2021? Why do we not yet have equity when it comes to pay and wages? And you can post in the chat box or take yourself off of mute. So one person responded, would it be that there just isn't discussion about it and many people are told to keep quiet about what they make? Yeah, absolutely. Discussion about wages definitely affects this gender pay gap. So what we see is that folks can be retaliated against and fired for discussing wages. And discussing wages in our jobs is seen as a no-no, right? It's very hush hush. We don't talk about how much we make. But if we continue that, that allows for this this difference to exist and to continue on. There was a couple other responses. Give me 1 second here. Someone said, because of persistent sexism and toxic masculinity. Absolutely. So sexism is embedded in our institutions and our systems, right? So when we are working towards eliminating this gender pay gap, that means that we need to be fighting against sexism and all those different other isms as well. As we mentioned, racism, ableism, ageism, because they all are impacted by the gender wage gap. Someone posted gaps in employment due to maternity leave or family caretaking. Absolutely, and I will mention that later on. But women are oftentimes the people who are doing the caretaking either for children or elderly folks. And so they're negatively impacted because they might have to take more time off or have less flexibility in their job. And then also maternity leave impacts folks as there are not many programs to support women as they re-enter the labor force. And then someone else posted fewer women in management and leadership positions. Absolutely, and that goes back to the point about sexism. And then to that point, when we think about who is in positions of power, specifically thinking about our government, we see men as the majority stakeholder, or those with power in our government. So if they're the ones creating the laws, they might overlook what is affecting women and maybe be less empathetic or sympathetic to trying to create change. So why else does this wage gap exist? So as we mentioned before, it has roots in systematic inequalities. Women are overrepresented in the informal, and I'll put informal work sector. So this would include jobs like street vendors, domestic workers, coffee shop staff, for example. And so these jobs oftentimes fall outside of the domains of labor laws. And so if they fall outside of this domain, that means that they can more easily be taken advantage of and have less protection by the law. Women do 3 times as much care than men. And so someone had mentioned that before. So women are doing most of the caretaking and domestic work like cooking, cleaning, taking care of children. And so these services that women are providing are the backbones of our communities and our economies. However, it remains undervalued and under-recognized. The motherhood penalty. So again, someone else had mentioned that. So working mothers are paid less than non-mothers. And so there's a couple factors that play into this. They may be reduced to their working time, right? Their ability to work. They often take on more family-friendly jobs, which has a lower pay. And then hiring and promotion. So if you take time off of work for maternity or motherhood, when you re-enter the workforce, right, that is a space of time where you were not working. So you were less likely to either get hired or to receive a promotion. And then also, as we mentioned before, how gender and sexism would affect hiring and promotions. And then a lack of programs to support mothers as they re-enter the workforce. Gender stereotypes allow this gender wage gap to persist. So gender stereotypes and what we think of as traditional gender roles can steer women away from occupations that have typically been dominated by men. And so if they're steering away from those positions, that means that's pushing women towards work that is often regarded as unskilled or soft skilled labor. And again, we know that those jobs are lower paying. Questions or comments before I move on to the next slide? All right, so when do women catch up? So here are our 2021 equal pay days. So again, these dates are after, or this would include the 2020 year. So after men earn, the $1 from 2020, women still have to work into 2021 to make the equivalent of what a white man would make. So for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, their date would be March 9th, which would have been yesterday. So they would have finally got their dollar. For looking at women overall, it would be March 24th, so at the end of this month. When we look at Black women, their equal pay day is August 3rd, so they got a while to go. Native and Indigenous women would be September 8th. And then for Latino women, it would be October 21st. So almost a whole additional year just to be equal to what a man would make. Now, I don't know about you all, but that's not right. And women are working just as hard and deserve to be paid, just as much. We shouldn't have to play catch up into the next year. All right, so moving into some solutions, what can we do? So there's a saying, equal pay for work of equal value. So this means that a job that is the same or similar, or maybe a job that is not the same but of equal value, women need to be receiving equal pay. And so it's important that we note this distinction because women's work and men's work may involve different types of qualifications or skills, responsibilities, or working conditions, but they still have equal value. So they should still be receiving the same pay. What else can we do? We can ensure workers' rights to organize. So that goes to the point of being able to discuss what our pay is without fear of retaliation. So it's crucial that women are able to be a part of unions and employer leadership. We need a formalization of the, again, informal economy. So what we need to do is expand protection for those jobs that are deemed informal. Because again, as I mentioned, right now, women are not receiving the same legal protection. We need to increase minimum wages. So with women taking on these informal jobs, or, as society labels them, unskilled or soft skilled laborers, they are lower paying jobs. So we need to have an increase in the minimum wage. We need a widespread adoption of pay equity laws. And so on the next slide, I'm going to mention a law that was trying to be passed in 2019, I believe. But what this would do, an adoption of pay equity law, it would require employers to regularly take a look at their compensation practices. It would require employers to assess their gender pay gaps and then take action to eliminate those pay gaps. A huge one is transparency, and that goes back to the workers' rights to organize. There needs to be an openness about the criteria and decisions regarding pay. And then this last one, remuneration. And so what this means is when we think about the gender pay gap, it's more than just wage, right? So it's more than just the money that you take home. It is talking about all the elements of someone's earnings. So in addition to wages, we need to be talking about overtime pay, bonuses, travel allowances, insurances, and other benefits that come with employment. And so someone's basic wage is only a small part of a worker's full compensation. So it's important that we not only pay attention to the wage, how much someone takes home, but the employment as a whole and the pay there. Any questions or comments about this slide? So one example of a law that we could have passed would be the Paycheck Fairness Act. And so what the Paycheck Fairness Act is, it was introduced in 2019 by Representative DeLauro and Murray. And it actually had the support of the entire Democratic House caucus. And so this bill would help to protect workers from retaliation for discussing pay. It would limit the use of salary history in making hiring decisions, and that's a key one. I filled out applications before where it says, how much did you make at your previous job? And so when we disclose that information, and especially for women, what that can do is perpetuate this cycle of the wage gap. Because if they see, okay, I only made 30,000, or let's say Cinnamon only made 30,000 at this last job, I was gonna give them 40, but because I see they only made that much last time, you know, I'm only gonna offer up 33 instead of the full 40. The Paycheck Fairness Act would also close any legal loopholes that may have helped employers avoid liability. So what we see here is accountability for employers. It would implement negotiation skills training, which I think is very important because there's been studies done where it takes a look at gender and negotiation skills and like how comfortable people feel even, you know, trying to negotiate salary. And what we see is that women are less likely and feel more uncomfortable trying to negotiate salary. So being able to build some skill around that could help decrease this gender pay gap. It would require pay data collection to strengthen enforcement, which is important because if we don't have data about this information, right, someone can just say, oh, well, that's not happening, or I'm not doing it, or my company isn't doing this. So it's important that we have this data so that there is accountabilities for employers. And then it would also improve remedies for people who file sex-based wage discrimination claims under the Equal Pay Act. So I'm a huge proponent, let me go back, sorry. I'm a huge proponent of legislation, and the reason why someone might say, well, why would we need federal legislation or why would we need state legislation? That's because we need to include everyone. Small businesses tend to do a better job of paying women at an equal rate or a similar rate, but it's important that we have either state and federal legislation so that all companies and employers are paying equal wages. Does anyone else have thoughts on what we can do to narrow this gender wage gap? Someone commented in the chat box, scheduling, so including flexibility, absolutely. Quality childcare availability and affordability. Yes, that's a huge one. Childcare is ridiculously expensive, and we could do a whole nother training on that. But absolutely being able to have affordable childcare and making sure that it's available. And then sick days or vacation time should also be considered, absolutely. And that goes back to the notion of not just thinking about the wage, but other things that are a part of pay. So paid time off, things of that nature. Any other ideas on what we could do to try to narrow this gender pay gap? Encourage girls and women to enter employment fields that typically pay more. Absolutely. And I think we've seen a huge push in STEM in the past couple of years. And those fields typically have a higher paying rate. And even in those higher paying fields, we still do see the gender wage gap exists, but absolutely. Any other thoughts? All right. So before I move on to this next slide about resources, does anyone have any personal experiences with this gender pay gap that they would feel comfortable sharing? I know personally, I am making sure that in my job, I'm talking to the other staff about, how much they're making sure that everyone is receiving equal compensation through employment. All right, so we'll go ahead and look at some resources here. So some larger organizations, we have the American Association of University Women. They have a lot of good information about the gender pay gap and some solutions that we can take to end it. We have the National Committee on Pay Equity. I think their name speaks for themselves. So those are two larger nationwide organizations. But then here locally, we have the League of Women Voters. And I know our local universities also host presentations on the gender pay gap. And then, of course, I have to mention the YWCA. We do good work nationwide, but also locally to bring it to the forefront about the gender pay gap, and then also trying to take action at a local level and then a statewide level to address this issue. So we know that the gender pay gap exists, right? It is an issue that is old, but is still relevant and still persistent. And we talked about some ways that we can take some action. So I want to see, does anyone have any questions or comments about the gender pay gap? You can post them in the chat box or take yourself off of mute. No questions, no comments? Well, I hope that means that you all are ready to go out there, excuse me, and advocate for the dissolution of this gender pay gap. But as I mentioned, you know, advocacy is extremely important when it comes to ending this gender pay gap, whether that be locally, talking to organizations, advocating in our own workplaces, and talking to our local leaders, and then looking statewide and nationwide as we advocate. And I encourage you all to do some more digging. You all had some great questions, some more digging into this gender pay gap. And again, taking a look at how intersectionality affects this gender pay gap. So when we add in race, when we add in ability, how someone mentioned age, how those things affect wage. But if no one has any questions or comments or concerns, here is my contact information. So if you think of a question, please feel free to reach out. I do these presentations about twice a month. So if you have an idea for a training that you'd like to see in our community or a future webinar, please feel free to reach out with that idea. I'd love to collaborate with folks as well in future trainings. But as I said before, my name is Cinnamon Porter and my email is below, cporter@ywcamclean.org. And I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here with me and to discuss this gender pay gap. And if there are no further questions, I will go ahead and end this training. Thank you all so much. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.